Refined argument. Why coercive, force doctrine, societies collapse. 1. Rights aren't privileges, they're functional survival tools. Social rights are not luxuries. They are adaptive constructs humans created because cooperation increases survival, autonomy increases investment in the system, trust reduces enforcement costs, stability requires voluntary buy-in. Remove these, and the society becomes structurally unstable. Step-by-step failure of a force-based system. Assumption 1. Benevolent intent. Even if we assume everyone shares the same goals, no exploitation, no malicious abuse, leaders act for the good of all, right arrow still fails. Why? Intent cannot override incentives, distrust, unequal risk, human psychology, reproductive strategy. A system that relies on permanent coercion cannot produce durable cooperation. Assumption 2. People comply under pressure. Assume alternative options are removed. People choose to work or participate. Right arrow still fails. Because compliance does not equal cooperation. People can do the minimum, disengage emotionally, avoid risk, stop investing long-term. A society runs on belief, not brute compliance. Assumption 3. No rebellion. Assume no sabotage, no protests, no uprisings. Right arrow still fails. Because societies don't need rebellion to collapse. They collapse when trust, motivation, and long-term investment erode. The critical failure point. Reproduction and future optimism. Every society depends on people believing the future is safe. Their children will have opportunity. They have agency. If people perceive chronic vulnerability or lack of autonomy, they respond with delayed family formation, fewer children, lower emotional engagement, withdrawal from caregiving roles. This leads to declining fertility, shrinking workforce, aging population, increasing dependency ratios. This is pure demographic math, not ideology. Why even perfect obedience leads to collapse. A coercive social order suffers a slow bleed. Trust declines, creativity declines, social capital declines, population declines. No dramatic revolution, just quiet, irreversible decay. You summarized it well. You don't need rebellion to kill a society. You just need people to stop believing in its future. Why it cannot be fixed internally. Every attempt to tighten control makes outcomes worse. More force, right pointing arrow, less trust, more rules, right pointing arrow, less innovation, more restriction, right pointing arrow, lower fertility, more pressure, right pointing arrow, lower loyalty. Eventually, control produces negative returns. No amount of discipline or force can manufacture trust, optimism, long-term commitment, demographic sustainability. Clean, high-impact conclusion, polished version. Even if you assume perfect leadership, perfect intentions, zero abuse, zero rebellion, and universal compliance, a force-based system still collapses. Trust and reproduction cannot be compelled. Societies don't fail because people rise up, they fail because people. Debate version. Why force-based social models collapse. Opening statement, 30 seconds. My argument is simple. Coercive societies don't collapse from rebellion, they collapse from attrition. Even if you assume perfect leaders, perfect intentions, zero abuse, and universal obedience, the system still fails. Why? Because trust and reproduction cannot be forced. Once people stop believing the future is safe, stable, or worth investing in, the society bleeds out quietly and permanently. Argument 1. Rights are functional, not optional. Rights aren't privileges. They evolved because they work. They create trust, cooperation, productivity, and long-term investment. When you replace voluntary cooperation with force, you destroy the very mechanisms that make societies stable. Point: a coercive system is structurally unsustainable by design. Argument 2: perfect compliance still fails. You can imagine the most charitable scenario. Everyone has benevolent intent, no one abuses power, no rebellion exists, people choose to work and it still collapses. Why? Because compliance is not cooperation. People do the minimum, avoid risk, and stop caring. Force can produce labor, but it cannot produce loyalty. Argument 3: trust, not rebellion, is the real failure point. Societies die when trust disappears. You don't need riots. You don't need revolution. You just need people to stop believing they are safe. Loss of trust leads to lower effort, lower cohesion, lower investment, lower long-term planning. Even obedient populations disengage silently. Argument 4: the demographic collapse mechanism. This is the kill shot. This is where every coercive system dies. Birth rate collapse. Once people, especially those taking on childbearing and caregiving risk, perceive loss of autonomy, higher lifetime vulnerability, no exit options, they respond rationally. Fewer children, delayed family formation, emotional withdrawal, risk avoidance. This is not ideology. It's demographic math. Fertility drops below replacement population ages, workforce shrinks, dependency ratio explodes. You cannot force people to create a future they don't believe in. Argument 5: control has negative returns when the system weakens. The instinct is to tighten control. But every increase in force reduces trust, motivation, creativity, and reproduction even further. Control stops producing stability and starts producing decline. Closing, 20 seconds. You can grant your opponent every advantage. Perfect leaders, perfect citizens, no abuse, no rebellion. Their model still collapses. Not because people fight it, but because people quietly stop investing in a future that doesn't protect or empower them. A society doesn't die when people rise up. It dies when people stop caring. Even authoritarian regimes know they need cooperation. A powerful argument is this: no regime, no matter how authoritarian, survives on force alone. Every regime knows it needs voluntary cooperation to function. This is supported by political science, history, and game theory. 1. Enforcement is always too expensive. Without cooperation, even the harshest states cannot police every action, monitor every household, enforce every rule all the time. If a regime tried to rely on force alone, the enforcement cost would exceed the society's total economic output. Every government understands this. 2. People control all the critical functions no matter how strong a regime is. Ordinary people are the ones who cook the food, transport goods, raise children, teach the next generation, build infrastructure, maintain technology, provide healthcare. If people silently disengage, the system collapses from the bottom up. Force can make people show up, but it cannot make them care. 3. Every successful regime invests in legitimacy. Even dictatorship work hard to create the illusion of shared purpose, national pride, fairness, stability, future prosperity. Why? Because they know that pure coercion produces decay. They need citizens to believe enough to keep participating. If belief collapses, no amount of force can save them. 4. Cooperation is a biological and economic necessity. Humans aren't machines. We require trust, reciprocity, agency, psychological safety. Without these, people reduce effort, reduce innovation, and reduce reproduction. A regime can threaten penalties, but it cannot compel creativity, compassion, or children. 5. Every real-world collapse proves this: the Soviet Union, Qing dynasty, Ottoman decline, East Germany, North Korea's famine, Venezuela's collapse, Mao's Great Leap Forward. None of these fell because people rebelled violently at first. They fell because trust eroded, productivity dropped, corruption spread, birth rates collapsed, people quietly disengaged, attrition, not revolt, kills regimes. Debate ready line you can use, even authoritarian regimes know force isn't enough. They spend billions on propaganda, incentives, and legitimacy because they understand the truth. Cooperation is not optional. Without voluntary buy-in, societies don't explode, they quietly crumble through attrition. Debate framework. Why theocracy is high risk and secular states are lower risk. A theocracy is not automatically evil, just high risk. A theocracy can function. It can even thrive under perfect conditions. But systemically, it is a high-risk governance model because rigidity. Laws are tied to fixed doctrine, low adaptability. Cannot adjust quickly to new data or consequences. Singular worldview. Enforces one belief over diverse populations. Suppressed dissent. Pressure builds silently over time. Belief greater than feedback. Survival relies on faith. Not evidence-based correction. Metaphor. Your metaphor, polished. A theocracy is like shooting yourself in the foot and hoping the bleeding stops. It might work. It might stabilize. But the risk of breakdown is much higher than in flexible systems. 2. Why secular states are lower risk. Secular systems succeed because they are adaptable. They allow multiple beliefs and identities, have correction mechanisms, elections, courts, constitutional checks, adjust to consequences faster, reduce rebellion by avoiding religious dominance, encourage science, innovation, and cultural evolution. Bottom line. Secular equals adaptive equals stable, theocracy equals rigid equals fragile. 3. Risk ladder, your categorization, cleaned up. 1. Extreme authoritarian regimes, right pointing arrow, highest risk, maximal oppression, minimal feedback, collapse likely when pressure rises, extremely fragile. 2. Theocracies, right pointing arrow, high risk, less brutal than extreme authoritarianism but still rigid. Ideology first collapses when doctrine clashes with reality, fragile under diversity, modernity, or crisis. 3. Partially religious democracies, right pointing arrow, moderate risk. Examples: UK, Denmark, Greece. Citizens' vote rights exist, religion influences culture and law, slight rigidity, but democracy moderates the risk. 4. Fully secular democracies, right pointing arrow, lowest risk, high adaptability, high inclusion, evidence-based lawmaking, best long-term survival. IV. The law of consequence, your concept. Clean version, removing freedom of choice creates predictable negative consequences. You cannot escape these outcomes by invoking morality or ideology. They are mechanical, not moral. Examples: banning abortion, right pointing arrow, higher maternal risk, healthcare strain, poverty cycles. Banning dissent, right pointing arrow, lower innovation, higher pressure, eventual revolt or decay. Enforcing one religion, right pointing arrow, alienation. Polarization, reduced cooperation. Systems fail when consequences are ignored. Comparing isolated rigid societies versus modern flexible societies. Isolated societies, e.g., North Sentinel Island. Extremely stable internally, high cooperation, low internal conflict but vulnerable to external threats, disease, disaster, invasion. Secular democracies, moderate internal conflict, high innovation. Alliances, external support, best survival against global threats. Key insight: rigidity can work, but only in isolation. In interconnected modern societies, adaptability wins. V. Summary table. Debate-friendly, system-type rigidity adaptability risk level notes extreme regime very high very low highest collapse likely theocracy high low high fragile under diversity partially. Religious democracy medium medium moderate religion symbolic. Democracy stabilizes secular democracy low high lowest most resilient isolated traditional society high low variable stable internally, vulnerable externally 7. Debate ready mic drop line. Theocracy isn't automatically evil, it's just structurally high risk. Secular states don't have better morals, they have better survival odds. Flexibility beats rigidity. Evidence beats ideology, and correction beats collapse. Answer 1. The pragmatic justification, strongest, cannot be refuted. We ought to use logic because using logic reliably produces predictions, survival, and successful action. Not using logic reliably produces failure. This justification does not assume logic is true, it only observes that logic works. Examples: if you reject non-contradiction, you can believe contradictory states, and fail to act coherently. If you reject modus ponens, you cannot plan, infer, or anticipate outcomes. If you reject consistency, you cannot maintain stable beliefs over time. The pragmatic argument makes logic the undefeated strategy for survival. It doesn't say logic is universally true. It says logic is instrumentally indispensable. Answer 2. The inescapability argument. You cannot avoid using logic, even when you try. To question logic, you must form propositions, infer implications, track contradictions, argue for a conclusion. All of these presuppose logic. So, using logic is not optional, it is a precondition for questioning it. This is similar to Kant's conditions of possibility and the transcendental approach. Answer 3. The normativity argument. The ought comes from if you want consistent beliefs, accurate predictions, and effective communication, you ought to use logic. You don't need to prove the ought. The ought is conditional. If you want truth, right pointing arrow, use logic. If you want survival, right pointing arrow, use logic. If you want coherence, right pointing arrow, use logic. If you want knowledge, right pointing arrow, use logic. If you want none of those things, fine, but then you cannot claim to know anything. Answer 4. The evolutionary argument. Brains that apply basic logic survived. Brains that didn't died. Not because logic is morally right, but because tracking cause and effect, avoiding contradictions, making predictions, has direct survival value. So, logic is what minds converge on when shaped by reality. This is not circular, it's empirical. Answer 5. The communication argument. A shared logical structure is what makes communication possible. If someone rejects logic, they can't distinguish truth from falsehood, they can't state a position without contradiction, they can't argue or understand arguments. Rejecting logic collapses meaning. So the ought is, if you want to communicate anything meaningful, you must use logic. The clean debate answer. Use this verbatim. You ought to use logic because logic is the only cognitive framework that reliably produces coherent beliefs, successful predictions, meaningful communication, and survival-oriented action. You can deny logic verbally, but you cannot operate, argue, or even think without using it. Therefore, logic is not just true, it is inescapably normative for any being that wants to reason, communicate, or survive. 1. Metaethics. How ought emerges from survival. We explore Why organisms naturally generate odds, how norms arise from survival pressures, why all moral systems secretly reduce to consequence-based rules, why rigid moral systems fail and adaptive moral systems survive. This gives you the foundation to argue. Morality is not divine or subjective, it's a survival technology. 2. Epistemology. Why coherent belief is a survival mechanism. Here we dive into why contradictions reduce survival fitness, why truth-tracking organisms outcompete illusion-tracking organisms, how logic, evidence, and prediction emerge naturally. This builds the argument. Logic isn't arbitrary, it's the stable equilibrium of minds in a real world. 3. Game theory and cooperation. Why societies need trust. This connects everything you've said about theocracy versus secular states, cooperation versus force, trust versus coercion. We analyze why cooperation beats force in repeated games, why trust collapses create demographic collapse, why regimes die from attrition, not rebellion. This is the mathematical backbone of your previous arguments. 4. Evolutionary cognition. Why brains converge on logic. This path explains why even animals use proto-logic, why contradictions confuse organisms, why inference structures evolved, why natural selection produces logical minds. This leads to logic as the universal evolutionary attractor for any information processing organism. The survival framework of reality. A unified theory of why logic, morality, cooperation, and stable societies emerge. Evolutionary cognition. Why brains converge on logic before morality. Before norms, before philosophy, there is survival pressure. Any organism must solve. Cause right pointing arrow effect, danger right pointing arrow avoidance pattern, right pointing arrow prediction, choice A versus choice B. Organisms that mispredict reality die. Organisms that track truth survive. This produces an evolutionary law. Organisms evolve toward logic like cognitive structures because they must track reality to survive. Even animals show consistency, tracking contradiction, avoidance, prediction, making inference, not because they believe in logic, but because reality forces it. Logic is not optional. It's the equilibrium of minds under natural selection. 2. Epistemology. Why coherent belief is a survival mechanism. From evolutionary cognition emerges epistemology. If your beliefs are contradictory, incoherent, unpredictable, you can't plan, anticipate, or prepare. Reality punishes epistemic failure. Therefore, coherent beliefs outperform incoherent ones. Truth tracking outcompetes illusion tracking. This gives us reason, inference, evidence, prediction, internal consistency, not because they are philosophically imposed, because they work. 3. Meta-ethics. How ought emerges from survival. Morality is not mystical. It is the behavioral strategy organisms adopt to maximize survival, reproduction, cooperation, resource stability. From this, oughts emerge. Examples: don't betray allies, right pointing arrow, cooperation increases survival. Don't murder tribe members, right pointing arrow, internal stability. Care for children, right pointing arrow, reproductive success. Don't steal, right pointing arrow, predictable social behavior. Every moral system that collapses contradicts survival logic. Every moral system that lasts aligns with it. Therefore, ought equals actions that reliably increase survival and reduce catastrophic risk. Morality is a survival algorithm. IV. Game theory. Why cooperation becomes mandatory. From meta-ethics, we move to social strategy. Game theory reveals in one-shot interactions, right-pointing arrow force can work. In repeated interactions, right-pointing arrow cooperation always beats force. In large societies, right-pointing arrow high trust produces maximum output. In tight regimes, right-pointing arrow coercion destroys long-term stability. This produces the most important result: societies that depend on force collapse from attrition. Societies that depend on trust outcompete them. Cooperation yields innovation, empathy, trade specialization, demographic stability. Coercion yields distrust, sabotage, stagnation, demographic decline. This explains why empires fall, theocracies or fragile secular states or adaptive cooperation-based societies dominate long-term political stability. Why secular, adaptive systems win. Combine everything above. Evolution shapes logic, logic shapes coherent belief, coherent belief shapes survival, norms, norms shape cooperation, cooperation shapes stable societies. This creates a predictable hierarchy. Lowest survival odds, right-pointing arrow, highest survival odds, extreme regimes, rigid plus coercive plus anti-feedback, theocracies, rigid plus slow correction, partially religious democracies, mixed rigidity, fully secular democracies, adaptive, flexible, isolated cooperative societies, extremely stable internally, extremely vulnerable externally. Pattern: the more adaptive the system, right-pointing arrow, the lower the collapse risk. The unified rule: everything reduces to one law. Survival selects for logic, right-pointing arrow coherence, right-pointing arrow norms, right-pointing arrow cooperation, right-pointing arrow adaptability, right-pointing arrow stability. Any system that violates these steps collapses. Any system that aligns with them thrives. The ultimate mic drop summary: logic is the brain's survival software. Morality is the tribe's survival strategy. Cooperation is the society's survival engine. Adaptability is the civilization's survival shield. The systems that endure are the systems aligned with reality.